Picture this. A man walks out of federal prison after 20 years. 20 years of his life gone. His best years, his prime. He walks back into a world that kept spinning without him, back into a world that didn't pause, didn't mourn, didn't even notice. And the organization he gave everything to, they gave him a handshake and a small cut. Now, most people you'd say, okay, that's painful. That's unfair. Move on. Process it. Maybe go to therapy. But Phil Leotardo is not most people. Phil Leotardo takes that wound, that 20-year-old festering bone-deep wound, and he carries it forward into every single room he ever enters for the rest of his life. He doesn't grieve it. He doesn't release it. He weaponizes it. And that right there, that one decision, is the reason that by the end of The Sopranos, more people are dead than anyone needed them to be. Phil Leotardo, boss of the Lupertazzi crime family, one of the most terrifying, unpredictable, and psychologically fascinating characters in television history. But here's the question nobody really asks. What was actually wrong with him? Let's start from the beginning, because Phil doesn't arrive in The Sopranos as a main character. He enters quietly. A name, a rumor, a made guy from New York, a capo under Johnny Sack. Respected, but mostly background. And that's already interesting, because the show makes a deliberate choice to let Phil simmer, to let you underestimate him. He's older. He seems controlled. He has a kind of rigid, almost statesman-like calm to him. And then, slowly, inevitably, the mask slips. Phil Leotardo was a product of the old school. He was raised on a specific vision of what a man was supposed to be, what a mobster was supposed to be. Loyalty without question, silence under pressure, violence as the first language and also the last. He came up in a world that told him his suffering was proof of his worth, that if you could take it, if you didn't break, if you kept your mouth shut while the world tried to crack you open, then you were real. You were made of the right stuff. Phil believed this completely. He built his entire identity on it. And that, more than anything else, is where the trouble started. Because when your identity is built entirely on endurance, on the romantic idea that your suffering makes you special, you become addicted to the suffering. You need it to mean something. You need it to be recognized. And when the world refuses to recognize it, when the world just moves on, you don't move on with it. You burn it down. 20 years. Phil said it constantly, almost like a prayer, almost like a wound he kept pressing with his thumb just to feel it. I did 20 years in the can. It came up when he was negotiating, when he was angry, when he felt disrespected, when people weren't listening, when they were. It was always there. And here's what's interesting about that. Most people who go to prison, if they make it through, they eventually stop leading with it. It becomes a chapter in their life, not the whole book. Not Phil. For Phil, those 20 years weren't a chapter. They were the thesis statement of his entire existence. Think about what that actually tells you. He didn't survive prison and come out free. He came out trapped. Trapped inside those 20 years, replaying them, measuring every slight, every reward, every sign of respect or disrespect against that benchmark. I gave 20 years. Did you? Did he? Did anyone? And the answer was almost always no, because most people hadn't. Most people had been out here living while he was in there rotting, and that created something in Phil that was darker than anger. It created contempt. He looked at Tony Soprano, a man who had successfully avoided serious prison time through luck and lawyers and sheer survivorship, and Phil didn't see a capable leader. He saw a man who had not paid, a man who hadn't bled enough to deserve what he had. Whether that was true is almost beside the point. What matters is that Phil believed it. Completely. Permanently. And you cannot reason with a man who has built a religion out of his own resentment. Let me say something that might sound strange at first. Phil Leotardo was terrified, not of being killed, though that fear was certainly present, not of prison. He'd already survived that. No. Phil was terrified of something much harder to name, something he himself probably could never have articulated. He was terrified of being nothing. This is the engine underneath everything, beneath the rage, beneath the brutality, beneath the constant invoking of his sacrifices, beneath the iron refusal to compromise. All of it is armor, all of it is designed to protect against the one thought he couldn't survive. What if it was all for nothing? What if the 20 years didn't make him special? What if the code he lived by was just a story old men told young men to keep them useful and controllable? What if the world had simply changed and left him behind, and there was no honor in any of it? just decades of wasted life. That thought, that genuinely unbearable thought, is what Phil could never face. So instead of facing it, he projected it outward, found enemies, found slights, found reasons to act. Because as long as he was acting, he didn't have to sit still, didn't have to feel. Grief is surrender. Rage is motion. Phil chose motion every single time. A man like Phil, raised in a world where vulnerability was the open wound that got you killed, was never given the tools for grief. So the grief went somewhere else. It became his personality. Okay, let's talk about Tony. Because here's the thing that most people miss about the Phil-Tony dynamic. Phil didn't hate Tony because Tony was a rival. He didn't hate Tony because of any single incident or business dispute. He hated Tony the way some people hate a mirror. Tony Soprano was everything Phil resented. Tony was charismatic. Tony was liked, genuinely liked, not just feared. Tony could be brutal and also funny. He could be cruel and also charming. He was capable somehow of existing in moral gray zones without completely destroying himself. He had relationships. Complicated, messy, real relationships. And Tony, crucially, had not done 20 years. Tony had gotten away with things. Tony had survived through luck and instinct. Tony hadn't paid the kind of dues Phil had paid. And yet here was Tony running one of the most powerful families on the East Coast. Respected, feared, and consulted. That drove Phil absolutely insane. But, and this is the key psychological turn, it wasn't just envy. Envy would have been manageable. What Phil felt was something deeper. It was invalidation. If Tony could have all of that without paying Phil's price, then what did Phil's price actually buy him? What was the meaning of those 20 years if this guy could skip the suffering and still end up on top? Phil's hatred of Tony wasn't really about Tony at all. It was about Phil's desperate need for his own suffering to be meaningful. Tony's existence, like his success, his comparative ease, threatened that meaning at the deepest level. And Phil responded the way he always responded to existential threats, with violence, and with an escalating, increasingly irrational commitment to winning at any cost. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The elephant that Phil Leotardo personally put in the room, sat down next to, stared at, and then beat to death while calling it names. Vito Spatafore. Vito was a made guy, earner, solid producer for the family, and Vito was gay. Something Phil discovered and responded to with a level of revulsion that, honestly, exceeded even the standard brutality of the mob world around him. This wasn't just business for Phil. This was personal. This was visceral. This kept him up at night. Now, the obvious conversation here is about homophobia, and yes, Phil was violently, pathologically homophobic. That's not in dispute. But let's go a layer deeper, because homophobia in men like Phil rarely exists in a vacuum. Phil's obsession with Vito was about more than sexuality. It was about contamination, about what Vito's existence meant to the image of the world Phil had built his life around. The mob, for Phil, wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a masculine ideal. A brotherhood of hard men who lived by a code. If Vito could be gay and be in that brotherhood, if the lines between what was allowed and what was not were that permeable, then what exactly was the brotherhood protecting? Phil's world had a very specific shape, and Vito was a crack in that shape that Phil could not allow. But here's where the dark irony gets genuinely Shakespearean. Phil Leotardo, and who hunted Vito to his death over questions of sexual propriety and masculine honor, was himself a man whose closest emotional relationships were with other men. His relationship with his crew, with his lieutenants, with the men he grew up with, it was emotionally intimate in ways that no relationships in his life with women ever seemed to be. The mob world that Phil deified was, in practice, a world of profound, same-sex emotional dependency. You ate with your guys, you confided in your guys, you wept over your guys when they died. The women were kept separate. The emotional life happened here, in this world, with these men. Phil's rage at Vito was, at least in part, a rage at a truth he could not afford to see. And the loudest denials are always the ones with the most to hide. Whether you read that as projection or simply as deep psychological irony, the result is the same. Phil destroyed Vito, not despite his rigidity, but because of it. His worldview had no flexibility, no room, no mercy. That was a feature, not a bug, until it wasn't. There's a kind of man who mistakes stubbornness for strength, who calls inflexibility integrity, and calls compromise weakness, and calls adaptation betrayal. Phil was this man completely. Tony Soprano, and whatever his flaws, understood that the mob world of the early 2000s was a world in decline. FBI pressure, informants, eroding loyalty. He adapted. He made imperfect deals because perfect deals weren't available anymore. Phil saw all of that as weakness, as proof the current generation had no spine. And he wasn't entirely wrong. But Phil's response to decline wasn't to rebuild something better. It was to double down, to become more rigid, more brutal, as if sheer force of will could hold back a tide that had been rising for 30 years. He loved the image of the old-school boss, the dignity, the gravity, the command. But he mistook the aesthetic for the substance. The real power of those old bosses was never rigidity. It was ruthless pragmatism dressed up in ceremony. Phil had the ceremony. He'd lost the pragmatism somewhere in those 20 years. Pride is the most seductive of the deadly sins because it wears the best disguise. Wrath looks like wrath. Greed looks like greed. But pride looks like dignity, like a man who knows his worth and refuses to be diminished. But pride has a metabolic problem. It requires constant feeding. And when it stops being fed, it doesn't quietly accept the slight. It compounds it, stores it, builds a ledger. Phil's ledger was enormous by the time he became boss. Every slight, every compromise, every moment where he'd been told to wait, all of it with interest. When the ledger gets that full, it stops being about any individual item. Winning stops being strategic. It becomes existential. Because not winning would mean the ledger was a lie, would mean the suffering was for nothing, would mean he was nothing. Phil couldn't stop. Stopping meant admitting. And admitting was not something his entire psychological architecture had any mechanism for. So he kept going, right up to the end. Phil dies at a gas station. He's just stepped out to see his grandchildren. A moment almost tender. The old man with the babies. A glimpse of something human beneath all that armor. Then the shot comes. Phil falls, and then an SUV rolls forward, over his head, in front of his family. No dignity, no ceremony, no last words, no acknowledgement of his station, his sacrifice, his 20 years. Just a man on the ground, and then physics, and then silence. Everything Phil ever wanted. Respect, legacy, meaning. And the universe answers with a parking lot and a cracked joke from an FBI agent watching nearby. It's almost unbearable in how perfectly it fits. The universe was not keeping Phil's ledger. All those years of rage and pride and rigidity, the world held none of it. The world forgot before he even hit the ground. So, what was Phil Leotardo's problem? Pride, resentment, rage. Sure, but you already knew that. The real answer: Phil was given a genuine wound. And instead of healing it, he made it his identity. Those 20 years stopped being something that happened to him and became the entire explanation for him. And once the wound became the identity, he couldn't let it go. Because then what was left? Who am I if I'm not the man who suffered? He never found out. He didn't let himself. He is what happens when the wound becomes the weapon. A villain you can understand without forgiving. A man whose destruction was his own doing, made inevitable by forces he never chose. Phil Leotardo died the way he lived, convinced he was owed something by a universe that had already moved on. The SUV rolled. The world kept spinning. And somewhere, Tony Soprano ordered onion rings.